So over the past week or so, I've continued to test the Ally out as much as I can, just firing up a ton of different games and experimenting with, power versus performance, and all of that good stuff that I normally do whenever I get my hands on a new piece of gaming hardware. However, in the course of all of that testing, while of course I fired up just like dozens of different titles just to sort of, kind of hop around buffet style and see what's available, there have been more than a few games that just grabbed my attention because they were just super fun, or they just played incredibly well on the deck, and it made me just sort of kind of stop testing a little bit just so I could, have some fun with the Ally itself and just, dive into a really great game. So that's what today's video is all about, are just 5 different games that I've played so far that have really resonated with me the most and just seem to play really well on the Ally that I'm just having a whole lot of fun with. And the first game on this list I believe is the first game that I fired up at all on the Ally, at least briefly just to see how it would look, and I was incredibly impressed with it, and it's a personal favorite of mine anyways, and that is Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now I know this and the Resident Evil 2 remake both run well on the Steam Deck, but on the Ally screen and with a tethered 30-watt power delivery, it absolutely screams on the Ally. So much so that I was just blown away seeing a game with this sort of visual fidelity run at a pretty solid 60. To be fair, I could get a fairly consistent 60 FPS on the Steam Deck, but not without some compromises, whereas here the image is just noticeably sharper and that screen helps out a whole lot. Now I know that Resident Evil 2 is usually held in a higher regard than the more action-focused Resident Evil 3, but I still have a lot of love for Resi 3 specifically because of that more arcadey nature. Plus, despite that more action-oriented focus, it still has some great scares, and it opens up Raccoon City even more, so I had a blast revisiting it, and figure over the course of a few nights I can probably knock out a whole nother run of Resident Evil 3, probably while watching the original Resident Evil movies in the background on my couch while I do, since they are admittedly a guilty pleasure for me. Also, something else I really enjoy about 3 is that it is a fairly short game that you can beat in about 6 or so hours, which makes it a prime candidate for a handheld like this where battery life is going to be at a premium. And thankfully, whether you're playing in the 25-watt or 30-watt turbo mode, you'll get solid visuals and a steady frame rate. So if you're like me and love to play horror games in portable form where you can just be completely enveloped in the darkness and you're 100% focused on the scares right in front of your face, the Ally seems like a great place to do exactly that. And speaking of campy horror games, this next one is a fairly recent pickup for me, and as soon as I saw the trailer for it, I knew I was going to have a good time with this, and I absolutely am so far and highly recommend it, and that is Killer Frequency. As a fan of thoroughly saturated colors, and seeing as how this particular color palette looks great on the Ally screen anyways, this was a really exciting game to dive into. Killer Frequency is a first-person horror game where you play as a radio DJ in 1987 in the small town of Gallows Creek. Through a sequence of events I won't spoil here, all of the town's 911 calls start getting rerouted to you at the station as a serial killer stalks the residents of the town. Based on the choices you make, you'll either end up saving the residents or listen on in horror as they meet an untimely end. Initially you'll just be in the booth spinning records and taking calls and, just being a radio talk show host, but as the tension starts to build, you'll gradually start exploring more and more of the station and begin fielding more and more calls from the potential victims. It is terrific fun if you're a fan of horror flicks, and as somebody who grew up watching a lot of teen slasher horror flicks in the 90s and 2000s, this was right up my alley. The visuals are fairly cartoony, but being set in 1987 means it's dripping in neon ambiance, and it looks super great on the Ally, not just because of the gorgeous screen, but the RGB of those analog sticks actually ended up lending a subtle, expanded charm to the presentation. Maybe that's a little bit of a reach as an Ally-specific feature, but I mean, to be fair, I've got RGB stuff all over this place, so naturally that was going to appeal to me. What might be a more compelling reason to play on the Ally is that unlike a lot of beefier AAA titles, Killer Frequency has no problems running at a much lower power draw, and you can keep 90 to 120 FPS without crushing the battery as quickly as in other titles. I suspect this would do outrageously well on the Steam Deck too in that regard, but given that the Ally is the shiny new hardware for me, I'm definitely going to wrap it up on this device. And speaking of beefier AAA titles, what is the point of having a device that's as powerful as the Ally if you're not going to try to put it through its paces with some beefier AAA experiences that can take full advantage of all that power? And this next game definitely is a personal favorite, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people, Marvel's Spider-Man. Now considering we've got Spider-Man 2 dropping later this year, I had exactly zero problem diving back into 2018 Spider-Man just to get reacclimated to everything leading up to those events. Of course, if you've played Spider-Man already, then you know it's a pretty memorable experience, but still, it's as thrilling as ever to suit up as everyone's favorite wall crawler and go zipping around New York beating up Fisk's goons, searching for long-forgotten backpacks from Peter's now years of Spider-Manning, and slowly filling out that 100% completion meter with a ton of side activities that are actually a good time. Now, Spider-Man does run on the deck, but it does not run as fluidly as you'll find here. You won't be getting 120 FPS or anything with the graphics cranked up, but this is another example of where the Ally is just an absolute beast and making sure the action remains smooth even when you can't hit a target frame rate consistently. When I look at the overlay for Spider-Man, it's usually showing under 60 FPS, but at the same time, without looking at the overlay, it's rare that I would even be able to notice when it does dip below that threshold. And I'm pretty sure this is thanks to how Ally's implementing VRR to keep things smooth even when there is a dip, but beyond that, the 1080p screen really does make the details and textures pop here. Pete's suit looks absolutely fantastic, and in a game this pretty, even if you're only getting like an extra 5% in visual fidelity, it makes a big difference. I don't think I can rightly say that it exceeds playing it on the PS5 or anything, but it is imperceptibly close, and playing on the Ally felt like I was playing in an almost uncompromised way, save for the occasional dip into the 30s while swinging in the open city. Still, it's fast, sharp, and fluid, which is pretty much a must in any action game, but particularly in one as fast-paced as Spider-Man, where there's just so much flexibility in how you approach combat, and enemies can close in at any angle, demanding a quick response. Of course, while the Ally can easily handle the workload of keeping the on-screen action moving, it chews through battery ruthlessly, so most of my sessions with this have been me either playing at my desk tethered to an outlet, or on the couch tethered to a beefy backup battery that can keep the action going for at least a couple of hours before I have to swap in a new power source, or just tap out. But hey, replaying Spider-Man bothers me exactly not at all, especially if I can do that while I'm watching Spider-Man 2 in the background. Next up is a game that a lot of people recommended in the comments here over the past year or so as something that I had to check out on the Steam Deck, and while it plays tremendously well on Steam Deck, it also plays like a dream on the Ally, and that is Vanquish. Vanquish is also a fast and fluid game with lots of over-the-top camp and ridiculous cutscenes, and I just love it. As a Platinum game, the mechanics are airtight and just good arcadey fun with thrilling moment-to-moment action, combining the best of pop-and-stop third-person cover shooting with blistering speed as your suit lets you rocket and slide all over the map. And in so doing, you'll be covering a ton of ground really quickly, which will allow you to snatch up weapon upgrades or just deal with fast-moving threats in a really satisfying way. All of these things combined have kept Vanquish firmly in the in-progress collection of my Steam library, as a game that I actually want to finish rather than just let it get swallowed up by the backlog. I've said countless times that one of my favorite types of games to play on the deck were older AAA titles or heavy hitters from that sweet spot of about 10 to 15 years ago. And that's because these normally ran a lot more comfortably on the deck hardware, and because they were a lot less taxing on the GPU, you could typically see much longer battery life. And while I wouldn't say the battery life is quite so long as the deck, you can absolutely crank the visuals in Vanquish to max and get 80 to 90 FPS in 30-watt turbo mode, and stay right around 60 FPS if you drop down to 25 watts untethered. Although I will say, as much fun as I'm having bouncing around in my rocket suit in Vanquish, I did notice some screen tearing, but curiously it only seemed to be happening during the cutscenes. That, or maybe I was just so concerned with not burning through my suit's power amidst a hailstorm of bullets that I just didn't notice it was happening there too. Either way, Vanquish is lots of fun, runs great on the Ally, and I couldn't help but appreciate the irony of playing an action game where you have to be careful about how much power you're using, on a device where I have to be careful about how much power I'm using. And finally, even though I love high-octane games in the vein of action or horror, I also really like to bring that action down a few notches to just sort of chill with a game, and one that I decided would be a really relaxing time to explore on the Ally was to revisit Sable. Sable is a delightful breath of the mild with a gorgeous world where you play as a young girl who's going through a rite of passage. Specifically, you're on a mission to find an appropriate mask that suits you and your place in the world before returning to your clan. It takes place on a desert planet and is heavily centered on exploration, platforming, and puzzle solving. It has no combat to speak of, so it's a great way to unwind after a long day or just to give yourself a breather between more intense titles, and that's exactly why I love it so much. Well, that and the hover bike, which is great for exploring all of the sites and locales featured within. Now, Sable's most distinguishing feature is probably its visuals, which I'm pretty sure are cel-shaded if you're a fan of that particular art style. But I also love the animation, which is fluid in most instances, but it looks like Sable herself is animated at a reduced frame rate, kind of the way Miles looks in Into the Spider-Verse, or the way you might have seen in Proteus, though I don't think the effect is quite as pronounced here. But all of these come together beautifully on the Ally's screen, and digging into the settings, I think this is the first game I've noticed that has a specific selection available for variable refresh rate, and enabling it made for a very smooth experience in my time with it, and it didn't seem to drain the battery nearly as heavily as other games that I've tested so far. All in all, Sable's just a refreshingly chill time, and I can't wait to spend more time with it whenever I just, again, kind of need a break between more action-oriented games. So again, outside of buffet-style hopping my way through dozens of titles just to see how they fire up at all on the Ally or what kind of performance you can expect, these are just a few of the games that I'm firing up just for a little bit of me time, just to have some fun with the Ally and just dive into a really fun game that I personally really enjoy. And I gotta be honest, just about every game that I've fired up on the Ally has run really well, so I'm real pumped to start making more content for this device and seeing which games run well on it. But I would also love to have your feedback as well. Do you want to see more gameplay on the Ally? If so, please let me know in the comments below. If not, then I'll probably just more do generalized PC gaming content and just, go over the things that are coming out, stuff that I've been picking up, and, kind of the list style videos that I've done so far. But again, if you have any suggestions or feedback, I am always open to that. As always, thank you so much for taking the time out to watch. It really means a ton to me. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.